always by the GSMC Sports Network. I really hope you guys enjoyed that Euro segment. I love talking the beautiful game with you guys at each and every single opportunity I get. So, I hope you guys enjoy that segment. But before we get into our fantasy player profiles and switching to the mindset of the upcoming fantasy football season, I want to remind you guys yet again that if you do feel so inclined, please consider leaving a tip at the link gsmc.cloud. Is a huge support to both me and my fellow podcasters, and ultimately the network, so anything you leave is greatly appreciated. But without further ado, let us transition from the world of a beautiful game to another beautiful game, at least to American fans, in football, and specifically fantasy football. We are going to continue our fantasy player profile with a exciting wide receiver, especially someone who's going to be in the wide receiver one conversation as we get closer and closer to the fantasy draft time. That player, of course, is Tyreek Hill. Now, Tyreek Hill, like I said, describing him in my shorts, is one of the most electrifying players in the NFL when the ball is in his hands. And so, I expect this year to be one of the biggest years Tyreek has ever had, especially if Tua is hungry after signing a big contract. That will certainly motivate him to continue feeding Tyreek Hill. But let's look at Tyreek Hill's fantasy career stats first above anything else. 1,586.5 fantasy points accrued throughout his career. His best season was last year, where he garnered 257.4 fantasy points. He was last year with wide receiver 2, of course. He was battling with CeeDee Lamb for that wide receiver 1 position. Ultimately fell a little bit short, but he can take something away from last season, that it was a career high year for him in almost every category. Career highs in terms of targets with 171 receiving yards at 1,799, and fantasy points per game where he averaged a crazy, staggering 23.5 fantasy points. He was also first, and this is very important to know in terms of, say, PPR leagues, if you're interested in him there, in target share, second in air yard share, and first in yards per route run. So if you're someone who's very interested in good route running receivers, especially in terms of PPR and receivers who are going to get a fair share of targets, especially in a system much like the Miami Dolphins, then Tyreek Hill is definitely your guy. Now, let's get more into how Tyreek Hill can potentially be that wide receiver 1 position at the end of the upcoming fantasy football season. The thing about Tyreek Hill, and I fell victim to this much like last year, is that when you compare him and CeeDee Lamb, who was the wide receiver 1 last year, Tyreek Hill has Jalen Waddle. And to bring Jalen Waddle into perspective, he was on my fantasy team. And while he's a fantastic wide receiver 2 option for a fantasy team, it's definitely annoying considering the fact where you can be like, oh, I wish I had Tyreek Hill. Whereas you kind of feel like CeeDee Lamb in that Cowboys offense definitely tends to get a lot more attention because of the fact that his second receiver is an aging Brandon Cooks. Now, I'm not saying that it's a hindrance to Tyreek Hill because of the fact that a lot is centered around him in terms of what this Miami Dolphins offense does. I just think that I'm a big fan of promoting balance in fantasy sports. I want someone who is not going to always swing for the fences. I want someone who is a top-level receiver, can get me that 20-point performance, but I also want someone who is a little bit selfless and is more of a 12 to 15-point score. Because I like to think of it as, if I can have 2 of those guys, and then on any given week, one of them somehow elevates their game, then that's a absolute deal breaker for me. However, that's why I'm not a big fan of like the wide receiver 1 and wide receiver 2 types. It's through no fault of their own. because they're fantastic players who everyone covets on fantasy draft boards. But that's the reason why I also have to hate them, because of their overvaluation. And so, while Tyreek Hill is certainly going to be in that discussion, I certainly feel like there should be much more opportunities for everyone else on this Miami Dolphins offense, especially in a contract year for Tua, where he needs to show that he's not completely over-reliant on one particular skill position player to provide him with the necessities he needs to succeed. And so, I think that Tyreek Hill is still going to have another fantastic year because it's in his nature. His speed and electricity and his verticality just offers something you don't often see at the wide receiver position. But I would love to see a lot of different players on this Miami Dolphins offense really rise to the occasion because they need it. I think that it's very telling for someone like Tyreek Hill to be first in target share, because it just goes to show that even in a Miami Dolphins system that doesn't necessarily seem that desperate, they certainly seem to want Tyreek Hill to be that force. And I just don't see it that way. I see it as more of a balanced offense because you get the best out of every single player. Waddle's a fantastic slot and outside receiver. He can run routes for you. Devon Achane and Raheem Mostert are a fantastic 1-2 running back tandem that are going to have success in this system for the next couple of years. I also think that you want to incorporate a lot more tight end stuff as well. I just think that in a team that wants variety in the Miami Dolphins, Tyreek Hill, yes, he's the most varied player in the NFL at this very moment in time, but he also presents a challenge when you have a team that is so focused on dominance of an opponent that you don't utilize them to their best effect. And I know I'm kind of harping on something that Tyreek Hill can't control, but I just feel like the Miami Dolphins offense is just such an interesting one to diagnose, especially in fantasy, because of what Tyreek Hill brings. I think that Tyreek Hill is an overwhelmingly pivotal player in the fantasy landscape just because of how much of a burden he can be to a team. Because, like I said, I picked up Jalen Waddle fully expecting him to be a fantastic wide receiver too, and he did show flashes of that. There's always going to be a couple of games where, say, Jalen Waddle carries the load, or he may have to carry the load because Tyreek Hill is relatively, in some ways, injury prone. We saw last year. And Jalen Waddle will get his opportunities. But in order for them to be fully confident in someone of Jalen Waddle's caliber, they're going to have to be willing to give him the ball. And right now, Mike McDaniel's saying that we do have a fantastic offense. When all is said and done, Tyreek Hill is the guy. And I just don't see a world where, Tyreek Hill's production ever goes down. But I do want to see a world where at least Tyreek Hill's production doesn't kill the production of other players. And this is not a denigration of Tyreek Hill. I don't want it to be. We should, in fact, be celebrating Tyreek Hill's status as someone who has always been a reliable force for a fantasy team. As a fantasy manager myself, I would be considering Tyreek Hill as my wide receiver one any given day of the week. And you guys should too. But I just think that what he giveth, he taketh away from a whole sum. I think Miami is going to be a team to focus on in terms of whether or not they can become a sum of all the individual parts that they have at their disposal. And Tyreek Hill is going to have to find a way to kind of ease the control he has over this offense. I'm not saying he needs to ease his production, because some of my words could get misconstrued here, and I don't want that to happen. All I'm saying is that Tyreek Hill will always be wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2. But I want to see someone like a Jalen Waddle emerge as potentially a wide receiver 12 to 15. And that could happen. But for now, Tyreek Hill, while helping his fantasy manager, is kind of hindering the decision you have to make in terms of your wide receiver 2. Especially if you like guys like Jalen Waddle. That's my 2 cents about Tyreek Hill. That should just about do it for this segment of this fantasy player profile series. Coming up next, we have a running back who is definitely getting up there in age, but I really like the fit he's in now, moving from Tennessee to Baltimore. So we'll be right back with that fantasy player profile, and it should be a good one.